Hello everyone, it's Isopods and more with me. I hope everything is going well with you and you're taking care of yourselves and the ones you love. So this is not a care guide. This is definitely not what that is. I'm raising a colony of Porcellio Spinicornis. I call them SpiniCorns or Spinis or gold-handed isopods, whatever. I've been trying to research how to take care of isopods both in general and by specific species, and I have not had any luck in finding anything in depth about Spinis. I found general guides, again, about isopods and videos briefly talking about them in general, but nothing in depth in terms of handling them or taking care of them. And I just kind of realized in looking at the other monitor there that this is a pretty interesting white, gray, black palette going on here. Just unintentional. I didn't notice it until I looked over at the screen. More so with the black border too, that I don't know if I'm going to leave in. But I'm going to share with you what I have observed about the Spinis, both in the wild and then what I have been observing since housing them. And so before I actually get into it, I just want to stress again, this is not a care guide. This is not what you should do. It is simply what I am doing with the intention of sharing my experiences with you. If you all know of any material, care guides, just information about these Spinicornis in general, feel free to share it down below. I would really appreciate that. And then if you have any experiences of your own, feel free to share those too. I love that. The reason I want to gather information and get this experience, and the reason I seek it in others, is just to accumulate it and pass it on, prevent any kind of errors and mistakes like that. And the more knowledge, the more information you get, even if it's conflicting, because conflicting information can be a matter of, I live in Michigan, someone lives in Arizona, or, New Mexico as opposed to Canada. There's two completely different environments. The housing environment that you live in can be different in terms of humidity, temperatures, where your enclosures are, is there direct access or direct light, things like that all matter. So knowing experiences people had, even if, again, doing 1 plus 1 equaled 2, but then 1 plus 1 equaled 3 later, at least you know, well, to be on the lookout for those times it may equal 3, if that makes any sense. Over the last several years, I've been doing a lot of walking out in the woods here, a lot, regardless of the season. But only in the past maybe 6 months have I been researching and then getting into and then keeping isopods. So the interesting thing is how, in just the matter of those 6 months, how differently I look at everything when I'm going out there. Everything in terms of when I'm potentially looking for something to harvest, but even the way I walk and step out there, making sure that where sometimes I would just needlessly step on a piece of flat bark, I try to avoid it. It's kind of interesting in that regard. I look for mosses, lichens, and things like that. It's just interesting the way that changed. So when I found these guys, it was near a fallen tree, and with that, I've been stomping around, as mentioned, for months, and almost every time I see these guys, it's on the underside of the bark, regardless of which side is up or down, or leaves along that bark or under the bark. And it's, generally speaking, kind of dry. The trees, or I should say the bark, was, and specifically the wood, when I'm thinking about it, was very dry. The wood, so much so it was in most of the parts where you could just kind of pull it apart and things like that. It was kind of neat. And I wanted to make sure I froze those deeply to make sure I got any kind of pests, hopefully, out of there, because that, I think, was taken over by termites just, not looking forward to that if that happens. Now, I do intend to, this is all right now before any editing, so I hope I don't forget, but I do intend to show just various maybe videos or pictures that I took to reference some of what I see or saw. But I'm not very comfortable right now gathering leaves. I'm not sure which is which, and out there it's all the leaves are all mixed. And I don't really have right now any system set up to be bringing a bunch of leaves in through my apartment to the deck to keep out there, and then depending on how I'm cooking, baking, freezing, whatever, doing all of that yet. Again, I'm very new to this, and I'm not. I try to exercise patience.
Ooh, that's a bingo.
So I'm not eager to just rush into things like that. That's something I can plan for in the spring. And the reasons I am so keen on getting as much wood and leaves and mosses, lichens, all of that locally is I can as much as I can keep them in with their environment out here that I see them in, but more so take the things that I see them gravitating to or having a preference to. When I'm out there flipping hypothetically 50 pieces of wood, and in only 2 of them do I find an abundance of, in this case, Spinicornis, it may not be the case, but I assume there's a reason they congregated there as opposed to 2 feet to the left where there was another piece of wood, 3 feet to the right where the moisture conditions were different, and so on. I hope you get what I'm saying. It's something I try to observe actively when I'm out there. And while I'm not good at, not even remotely, identifying the wood types, I'm focusing on the conditions of the wood, what's around them, the leaves around them, if they are on top or on the surface, if they prefer to burrow in the surface, things like that. So again, when I find them naturally gravitating towards those conditions out there, I can try as best as I can to replicate them in here. One thing I am trying to navigate is, as I mentioned, as I see all these different conditions, I'm trying to make sure I'm aware of the different species out there. I know there's Omnissiah ocellus out there, Porcellio Spincornis, Trichelopus rathke, and I'm not sure about the saying, I had to put this one up. Phyllosia muscorum are all ones I've seen out there, and a couple of them specifically look similar and have crossover, and I'm very intent on making sure I can start to identify the differences. And I want to, again, read this part because specifically the differences between my Spinicornis, the ocelluses, those look alike, and even some of the smaller muscorum kind of have some, or I should say the larger muscorum with the smaller Spinicornis tend to have a little bit of crossover in the way that they look. And again, their environments are not entirely different out there depending on what is available and the conditions outside, the climate and the weather out there, I should say. And then additionally, Porcellio Spinicornis and the Trichelopus rathke have a lot of similarities in the way they look, and more so if you're not able to flip them, which again, out in the wild, I'm not flipping them trying to see how many lungs they have and all of that. So I try to wing it out there and then maybe worry about it when I get back in here and can sort. So in my observations, I wouldn't say that the Spinicornis likes it dry. I'm finding success housing and observing them seeming to prefer in nature a drier side, but with, again, access to damp conditions, moisture, or in the case of keeping them in your home or in an enclosure, making sure they have access to a robust hydration station, even if its size is limited. So both outdoors and in my enclosures, I have noticed them frequenting the underside of wood. Again, that keeps them off of the surface, which is not something exclusive to these guys, but it's not universal. Some prefer to burrow. So these guys do tend to prefer to be off of the ground and have access to the ground when they fall or when they need to forage and things like that. And I noticed they do prefer smaller leaves that are rolled and curled, and more so if when they get moist, they tend to have substrate accumulate or stick to it. They really like to stay inside those leaves. I find them in there a lot. In fact, when I sort through their containers, I'm very careful to go through all of those. And as much as I hate to do it, I go, if I'm specifically moving them, I will kind of, get all that dirt out of there to make sure they're not hanging out or clinging because they do love those. One thing I noticed out when I'm harvesting them is these guys, if you just get the wood and get a container under and kind of give them a tap with a paintbrush, one of their defense mechanisms is just to kind of let go. So they almost kind of tumble themselves into the container. So with that said, if you are doing that, be mindful because if you don't have it set up, they'll roll off and miss or onto a hard surface if there's a rock under there or something, or make sure your container has substrate in it, not just the empty plastic, because again, if you don't get it up, they may roll and ding themselves or injure one of their antenna, something like that. You don't want that. It makes it very easy once you start to get in the habit of doing it, but you have to be ready because again, these guys are fast when they want to move. They got a little pep in their step, so to speak. I haven't gotten any kind of visual feeding response from these guys, but they have no qualms eating fish flakes. I've noticed that of all the different kinds of isopods I keep, these have the least interest in dried shrimp. While my other guys kind of all go crazy for it, these guys tend to just leave it alone. I've only seen them really touch it if I don't offer anything else in terms of excess food. I always obviously have leaves and substrate, but if there's no food in there, and I just put the shrimp, they'll eat it. But if there's anything else in there, they'll avoid it. And additionally, I noticed that again, I try to put separate foods in there at different times to see which they prefer. I've noticed these guys have a tendency to really attack carrots, and while they do and will actively eat cucumbers, it's their preference right now, as far as I'm noticing, seems to be carrots. And as I start to feed them more, I do want to start getting honey, or I should say bee pollen, and other things that I don't personally eat myself or my kids don't eat, so I can't throw it to these guys. But I want to start experimenting and getting them more foods and seeing how they react. Also, they react pretty good to, what do I have? Rapashi morning wood. And I just sprinkle that. I don't do any of the other ways that they say you can use. I just sprinkle it in there on a rock or something like that so it doesn't get moist and doesn't get all gross and moldy, hopefully. And it's usually gone pretty fast with them overnight. If there is anything, it's just a little bit left. And I do mix, as you'll see in the video in a little bit, calcium sand directly into the substrate. I add it manually, sprinkle it, just it's fun for me. So I do have cuttlebone in there, but I don't see them actively attacking the cuttlebone. And I don't know if this species is just one that does not have such a voracity for eating cuttlebone, or if it's because they're getting it elsewhere. I don't know right now. They do eat it. I see it slowly going, but it's not, again, anything I see a massive attack on that as if they need it or there's any proclivity towards eating that. I keep and prefer to keep them in a clearer container as well. I know isopods easily benefit from being kept in darker conditions. I prefer to keep them near my window in the clear container and give them a natural day and light cycle and allow them to regulate that for themselves in that similar to food, access to food, and similar to access to moisture. I think that giving them the ability to go and find their own access to dark is something that's beneficial to them, because some of them that I'm noticing with these guys are very active. I always say they're always active and always about, and similar with my zebras. They're always active and about, and if it doesn't seem to be negatively affecting them and they're out eating, I enjoy that. So that's my preference. If I do ever get a species that has an adversity to light, or I notice start to have an adverse reaction when I do access light like that, that will change. But right now I don't want to say the opposite, as if it's making them thrive. I just see them active all day regardless. And no, I see Mankai out there mating during the day. So I'm going to continue doing that. And again, if there are different requirements for other species, I'll do that, but that's not the case for these guys. And I think that's about it. So let's hop into how I put together the enclosure and why I did some of the things I did, and maybe why I didn't do some of the things you think I should have done. With that, if you do have any comments about or questions about what I'm doing, suggestions about what I should do, let me know in the comment section below. Now I am going to basically sit through the entire 40-minute video, but you will not have to suffer through that for me. I'm just going to fast forward or time lapse it, as I say, through to the parts where I feel I need to point out something. And then before we start, I'm going to just go ahead and go through the materials that I started off with. I have a bag of Terra Firma and Terra Sahara from the Bio Dude, and then ABG Mix from Josh's Frogs. Quick note, I'm a disabled veteran, and for me personally, it's cheaper and a lot more beneficial to my back to buy substrate than it is to hurt said back in the process of making and putting all that together to try to save money. I understand lots of people do their own, and hats off to you if you have the patience and resources to do that. And if you do have your own and would like me to try it, let me know in the comment section below and I'll reach out to you. Next, I have both terrarium and regular sphagnum moss. Next is the wood that I harvested from the trees where I found these guys, both in terms of bark and dead wood. I treated both for a week or so, again, soaking, baking, and then freezing. Sometimes I froze certain things twice, especially the bigger chunks. Then here's leaf litter, which I need to start making sure to use more of. Thank you, Russ of Aquarimax, for that advice. I do buy leaf litter currently, but as mentioned a few times, I do want to start foraging and harvesting my own once I get more knowledgeable on doing it safely. I do have odds and ends pieces of cork bark that I purchased also. And then last, I think, there's moss that I collect out here again. I'm slowly trying to propagate my own mosses, but that's a slow process for me. But we're not here to talk about propagating mosses, are we? Oh, and the home for these guys is a 20-quart Sterilite 18 by 14 by 7 inch container. And as mentioned, the lid and container themselves are not very opaque, and I love that. But with all that out of the way and nothing more to say, let's hop into the enclosure. All right, so I'm going to let it play, but talk as I'm dumping dirt in there. That dirt is just random bags or containers that I had frozen once I isolated whatever I needed out of there. If I was moving them, things I bought them in, if they didn't go directly into the substrate, things like that, I freeze them, and then once I put together a container like this, after the things have been in there, for anything from 2 days to a couple weeks, I'll pull them out, let them thaw before I do this, and then those are what I usually start with, the base layers. And that's because I have less control over them, and they're less important because they generally don't get that deep. It's more of there just as a nice good base. And then when I start stacking wood and things like that, those are in there. Which is what I want to talk about next, is I do try to offer a lot of variety. and you'll see me very soon start to stack wood, leaves, and things like that vertically, not only horizontally. That is just because even as moisture and temperature level, light levels differ from the top to the bottom, I want them to have access to that. I always say I don't only want to offer them water, so to speak, in terms of humidity, or only in terms of direct access, meaning a pool or hydration station, or only in terms of moisture accumulated in soil. I like to have them have access to all of that. So again, if one has a tendency, or if they're molting and there's a different moisture level they need, or a different temperature level they need, they will have access to that in different spots also. So I do generally have one hydration station and then one semi-moist spot, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But I do want to say it's very important that at least I think it's important to offer that variety, which is also why I start to do things like mix leaves and the calcium sand in at a variety of levels. So I'll talk about that more in a moment. Let's get on with this. As you will see, I don't have a lot of peat moss, I believe it is, or cocoa fiber. I try to keep my soils very, I don't know the term, but more bioactive. And from what I understand, they cannot eat cocoa fiber, and peat moss isn't as healthy maybe, but I know peat moss also, from what I heard, it has a tendency to attract pests like mites and fruit gnats and fruit flies and things like that. Now here is where I'm just kind of playing around to see how I want this wood to be situated. I'm checking out the holes, trying to see, but it's just such a good piece of wood that no matter which way I laid it, I was going to be content. But I did want to make sure at least to have a plan, and then I start to set up now things under it to at least have it roughly in the manner that I want it, which again I think is cool because I'm going to layer around it. This will leave pockets, and I do want to point out that I was talking to, again, Russ of Aquarimax about another project where we were talking about microenvironments, and that's one thing I'd like to try to do, not just have a moist and a dry side, but have little sides that maybe dry within the moist side or vice versa, or again, very moist, ones that have the moisture more where I drip onto leaves and the leaves themselves start to get moist, and that's where the moisture will be accumulating there. I like to do that, and this is where I'm getting at the contact with these other pieces of wood, the moisture that will be under there, the leaves I put under there will allow activity for springtails, any of these spinnies that want to burrow more, again, get away from light, things like that, get access to the food that I naturally put in there, which again is something, part of the reason I prefer terra firma is that you'll see there's a lot of chunks of wood in there, and that's why I sprinkle and try to actively put lots of leaves in the different layers. Take time to, as I'm laying it horizontally, pause and put both leaves and calcium sand, so that again, at those lower layers, it's not just having access to it, it's beneficial for them to go there. Here's where I start to lay the base of what's going to be the moist side or hydration station, whatever you want to term it. Generally, as you'll see the sticker on that side, when I'm initially setting up my containers, I will eventually remove that sticker, but until I get better acclimated to which side is which, I leave that on for just a reminder that the dark side is more of the moist side. At least that's how I remember it when I'm putting the bin together before I remove the stickers. That's some of that calcium sand I'm going to put down. I like to just sprinkle randomly. The ABG mix is what I tend to do around the hydration station to retain moisture. It has charcoal bits in it, which is good for helping the springtails propagate and filtering out negative things that can do that. So again, it helps create a balance there. It retains moisture, I believe, a little bit better than terra firma, but it's also a lot less chunky, so to speak. Here's where I say I love this moss. I'm going to share a story later about my cricket fiasco, but yeah, they love this stuff. Watching it just slowly get stripped away is ironically beautiful because I kind of worked so hard to get it, and now I'm trying to propagate it. But just watching them destroy it slowly is just awesome. And I specifically put it over this part because I want this part to retain moisture, and this stuff just does well when you have that little bit of moisture with it. So that will help the moss kind of propagate itself, hopefully a little bit while they're eating it. And then look at this, is just like a piece of Swiss cheese. I love this piece. Again, these two pieces of rotten wood are collected, as are all of the bark pieces that you see so far. And so yes, the moss, the bark, and the rotten wood is all stuff that I collected. These are some of the leaves from the Biodude. Again, now you'll see it, I'm somewhat particular about the way I place a couple of these leaves, in that I want these to stay vertical. I'm trying to set them up so they don't fall down. I think I put some dirt around the base here in a moment and then start stacking them. Same thing with the dead wood. That's why I'm starting to, again, you'll start to see, hopefully, depending on how it looks from the top down, those different layers that I try to have and add and put in there. And this is terra firma, which again, that wood that you see, the chunks of wood, is just phenomenal. I sometimes hate it when I need more just soil and less wood, but in terms of what I'm doing here and the fact that they love eating that stuff, it's great. Springtails also, the isopods love it, and it's just, this is such a good mix. I am looking into, if I ever get enough money, actually buying his isopod substrate, but that's one day in the future and pie in the sky, so they say. And here we go again. I like to shove leaf stems or pieces of thin bark or wood down through the layers horizontally. So again, it gives them different access to different layers, but specifically it gives them access to go down into the hydration station. And I do also, you'll see, they will have access in different ways, but I like to add different ways for them to access it. I like to get substrate stuck to the pieces of wood as I lay them down. Generally, I actually spray them down. You'll actually see me do that here in a little bit. I'll spray them down and then roll them around, get substrate and calcium sand stuck to them. There we go. As I try to find out how I'm going to lay this, I do want to note that the main piece of wood you see now, I do like, and while I wish it was longer, I do like and always recommend that you put a longer piece, whether it's on the top or, as you'll see, this piece is going to eventually get buried. I believe all the way, but giving them horizontal access across under can help them. Again, getting different access to layers of moisture and resources, letting them regulate that and move freely about. But I'd argue it's kind of just as important to make sure when you have the top set up, you have a piece of wood like that to, again, give them the ability to navigate directly to moisture areas and moisture gradients. So far, all of this soil has been terra firma, and all of the moss that you see has been my own. I'm just trying to kind of even out the moisture, the hydration station, so I can kind of start moving on from there. What I try to do is use the terra firma on the moist side entirely, then on the drier side, I'll kind of ramp or slope off, and then start to have terra sahara kind of around midway start to be towards the top, and then fill out the bottom of the dry side, as you'll see when I get there. Oh, I love crunching up these leaves. And this is important, like I say, to make sure I establish a very good lower base of nutrition for them, things they can eat, hides for them, moisture levels, a variety. Again, I give them moss, dead wood, the substrate, those kinds of things. I want them to have an abundance of whatever I'm giving them. And then this is putting more charcoal in the hydration station because, again, it helps with springtails and just the maintenance of the bin, and then sprinkling some more calcium sand. I like to put a little base layer of sphagnum moss even on the dry side like that. That way it does retain at least the basest level of moisture. Or as mentioned, once I go and start picking a spot on the dry side for a kind of mini moisture zone, I can utilize those. Or worst case scenario, they're just in there dry, offering making the substrate looser and giving them the ability to burrow. Still more terra firma, because again, on these lower layers, even on the dry side, I do want to offer the dead wood. There's a lot more of it in here than there is in the Terra Sahara. And again, it will get dry enough, so I'm not worried about that. This can be as dry as I need it to, and then I'm going to start to spread it out here. Yeah, see, showing off those wood chunks. And then again here, taking a moment to try to place it vertically instead of horizontally, and make sure I put the dirt around it so it doesn't slip or fall or, not get knocked over. Another good chunk here that I find, and do the same on the opposite side. Here you can see the Terra Sahara. It's a lot more granulated, a lot less of the rotted wood you'll see. Here we go with another decent layer of smashed up leaves. I think I'd do something with a stalk here in a moment too. These are some aquarium rocks that I found that specifically my zebras and clowns and springtails tend to, specifically on the one in the top left, that red porous one, they tend to congregate on. And just, I also love to put food on it, the rapashi, and mush it in there with a paintbrush, and then you can see them actively, especially the springtails and smaller ones will be digging in the crevices to get it. It's really neat. These flat pieces of rock I originally bought for my gecko thinking they'd be good, but once I broke it up they were too sharp. So now I use them for feeding platforms, generally speaking. I also just throw them down in there, but I do try to keep one at the top. That's where I'll put the food, so if it gets moldy I can just pull the rock out and rinse it off and clean it, and it's not directly contacting the substrate. And then some more leaves. I grind up and put a nice fine little, not mini layer of sphagnum moss generally before I put the last coat of substrate on, just so that just below that it has another way to retain a little bit of moisture and again offer a little bit of aeration. It may not come out very good, but like that piece of wood is not laid flat. It's actually, again, not totally 90% vertical, but it is moving vertically, so to give them access to higher and lower soil levels and things like that. I think I spent some time here trying out different pieces of wood, but what I do want to point out before I go back to the quick lapse stuff is that you'll see me spray them down and kind of stick them, put substrate on them, maybe some calcium sand, because I like that it will just give it that texture or give them another reason to be on those things. It provides them the nutrition, and again gives smaller menkai and springtails different things to hide under or have access to that food. So you'll see me do that pretty frequently here. I think I try out 2 or 3 different pieces of wood before I find one. That piece is a magnolia leaf, and that's then the other leaf litter from the Bio Dude. I like those curved leaves. They're just so much fun to play with and watch the other little dudes have fun in them. But I do also try to put them under the flat pieces to give them a little bit of food and moisture, things like that down there. And I also, as you'll see, spray the leaves. And similar as I do try to put some substrate in them, in these ones specifically, just to, again, give different access to different... That is a micro example of a micro environment, but my point is it's just, again, adds that little bit of variety to whatever they're looking for. And here we go with the Terra Sahara, where I believe the rest of that dry side from here on out should be entirely filled out with that. And you'll see me, again, as I mentioned, to give what I consider a true moisture gradient, I do top off midway, and then again more towards one side, the back of it versus the front, I do kind of top it off with the Terra Sahara, make it more dry in that regard, and just a variety and more of a distinction in the environment too, if that makes sense. Now, I do want to say also, these guys, as I mentioned, don't tend to be burrowers. So the way I'm trying to promote them going deeper into the soil is keeping the soil loose and then poking sticks and leaving vertical access, as I mentioned, so that they don't have to go and burrow to get deeper. There are those natural channels and grooves and access areas that they can just go and naturally get into, not having to burrow. Those are the reasons I try to do this how I do it and stack it so tediously, and I like it, but I'm hoping that's what this will provide. Otherwise, I can go back and do another container where I have less substrate, because I want to say I have almost 3 or 4 inches in there, but that's, again, because I'm hoping to make them utilize the entire bin, not just the top 1.5 or 2 inches, and then have the other substrate in there, because if that was the case, I would just put 2.5 inches of substrate and save the other stuff for somewhere where it will be utilized. I don't like to just have the soil and substrate in there because. And then here I go putting I am putting a little bit more terra firma. I'm surprised. I'm wondering if I grabbed the wrong bag, but I'm also placing a little bit of the moss that I have. And I say I put down another magnolia leaf. That big orange one is a magnolia leaf. Those are mainly magnolia leaves, and just if it matters, I find magnolia leaves to be very thick, which is not bad. It is just that they take longer to decompose, and I don't want to say it's harder for them to eat. It's just I find they will naturally gravitate towards the thing that is easier for them to eat. If it's calcium and you give it to them in a hard cuttle bone or a different one, they will gravitate towards the softer, and I think it's something similar where they tend to prefer the softer leaves. So what I tend to do is smash them up and try to put them in the substrate, and then as you see me doing, cover it with some Terra Sahara, and then it is also a little bit hard to see, but like that leaf and the piece of wood you see to the right, while it looks flat, I do put it at an angle, so the bottom is lower, but towards the top of the screen, it actually angles up in the dirt. Similarly, that stalk is doing the same thing. And here is where I was mentioning where I spray and then put that substrate in there, and then we'll flip it. Yep. And I think this is actually the part where I start to try to navigate which pieces of wood to use here. I think the other one was already selected and fit, but these next couple pieces I think I'd play around with a little bit more. So after I place that piece, I do want you to note that the top piece has the exposed bark face down. The piece below that to the left with the leaf on it has the exposed bark up, and the piece all the way to the right on that dry side is a chunk of wood itself. Again, that's the kind of variety, and it does matter because, again, some species and some individuals just have a tendency to want to be on a certain texture or want to be up off of the ground, but again, they may prefer the type of wood or texture of another, the grooves of another over one other species or individual, and I try to offer that to them. And yep, that was it indeed. So that was how I build my enclosures. I'm not saying you should do this at all. I'm not saying you should do this for your Spinicornis. This is just how I build my bins, and why to some it may seem excessive or, you know, entirely too lengthy, but at least you know how and why I do the things I do. And again, if you have any comments, anything to offer, any criticisms, anything else, just let me know in the comments section below. That's the setup I have. I moved my Spinicornis into them, I want to say 2 days ago. I don't recall. I'll do an update on that. But until that update, or until my next video, or until I stop by your next video, I hope everything is going well with you. You're taking care of yourselves and the ones you love. Go easy.